were ever session directors at the campgrounds at Gary. Now, long before Lariat Creek, before they got the land and that camp developed there, Christian camping in Oklahoma had been going on since the 40s. I don't know exactly where it might have started, but eventually it went to the Roman Nose State Park area, and it was known as the Roman Nose Christian Youth Camp. And in 1973, the Reinhardt family, after looking and putting the appeal out, we want to find new grounds to build a new campground instead of using the state park, the Reinhardt family did a 99-year lease thing on about 40 acres they had for the camp. 2 springs are feeding this creek area, perfect area. Cabins were built the next year. 1974 was the first year they actually had sessions there. In the early years of camp, probably like in the 80s, I came across where Blackwell had quite a bit of involvement. Now, I'd always known Mike Query had done the beginner session there. What I didn't know is that David Reidenauer had done a session there, and that through the years, apparently, they made a cookbook, by the way, and it doesn't give a year that this was put together. I kind of wished I had that, but back when people were doing like self-published things, the years didn't seem, I guess, that important. But I can tell this goes back quite a ways. When the current caretaker showed me the box of items that I brought home eventually to take a look at, he showed me, oh, by the way, and camp used to have its own cookbook. And I wasn't assigned to that, so I didn't really care whether I had that or not. But he said, well, do you want to look through it? And I said, I don't know, I guess. The first page I opened to, and I wish I remembered, oh yeah, here it is. The first page I opened to was page 57. Chocolate-covered cherries, Anna Casera. Fudge nut bars, Patty Moore. One right above the other. I thought, I want that cookbook, so he gave it to me. I got it. Anyway, yeah, that's, does this look like anything? Are you? Well, it calls for 1 cup of oleo. When's the last time you've heard of the reference to oleo? Here's your mom's recipe. Take a look at it. See if, hey, tell her, I want chocolate-covered cherries. By the way, that's my mom's favorite candy. You might tell her that. But it's best when the pits are out of the cherries. Go ahead and open up your Bibles to Daniel 3. I believe we're streaming now. Is that correct? This is the title page. What about YouTube? Is anybody able to monitor that on YouTube? See if we're streaming? If we're streaming, hello. My son had, I think, a visitation scheduled. Okay, we're going live on YouTube. How far is the delay? I remember, that reminds me, we used to watch Jeopardy in college, and we'd always try to, not Jeopardy, Wheel of Fortune, and we'd always try to guess before. Y'all do that at home, right? I found out that it was on another channel, and it was like 10 seconds to 15 seconds earlier than the other. So I was always secretly watching that in the other room, and I would say, strawberries and cream, or whatever the answer was, you know. So they kind of wondered, how in the world did you know that? Well, anyway, if you're joining us, we're just trying to get our bearings with the streaming. Landon had funeral home duty, so he wouldn't be able to get here, so we're figuring it out up in the booth. But if you're on YouTube, it looks like you're on. Daniel 3, this is session 3 of our study on Daniel. And I might go ahead and say this, and I think they'll be watching. Mary and Bobby Burns are moving, and I have made a call to have some helpers. What time did I tell you, Scott? What time did we announce? I forgot now. 9:30? I hope it's 9:30. If you can help in any way, and I think Jacob was going to see if any of the teams would help to load up their moving van. They've got a people at Edmond when they get there to unload, but they need help. They're moving. We hate to miss you guys, but we know it's going to be better off for them, and that will be improving, I think, their quality of life. So anyway, Nebuchadnezzar. It's getting hot in here. Daniel 3. This chapter contains one of the most popular stories in the book of Daniel. As a matter of fact, I kind of just out of curiosity wanted to know, how does it rank? And I just limited it to Old Testament. What are the most familiar stories in the Old Testament? Well, for the book of Daniel, it's number 2, second to Daniel and the lion's den. And I wanted to know, how did it rank in the rest of the Old Testament? And I got varied answers. Sometimes it was way down the list. But in children's Bibles, which is probably where I know it's where I was introduced to this story, was out of a children's Bible, or it was a lesson taught at Sunday school. I mean, how many of you grew up in a church where that story of the fiery furnace was taught in Sunday school? Okay? So that's probably where we first pick up the story. And it's number 12. It seemed like the average. It differed in Bibles, but in most children's Bible, it ranks as the 12th favorite story of Old Testament. So it's a perfect example of how absolute power can corrupt someone absolutely. That's something I've heard Don say several times, when we've talked about, especially in the Kingdom Come series, where we're talking about kings that power had gone to their head. And this is definitely happening with Nebuchadnezzar. And it's kind of interesting, isn't it, knowing how we came out of last week's study where Daniel gives him the interpretation of the dream. I would have thought that Nebuchadnezzar would have been humbled by the fact his kingdom is going to be overtaken eventually by an inferior kingdom. It's described as an inferior kingdom, and that the other kingdoms would even follow that. But I think that now I'm getting the image or the view that Nebuchadnezzar thinks, well, as long as I'm king, we're the best. Everybody else is going to be inferior. And there's not necessarily anything in the dream that destroys Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom while Nebuchadnezzar is alive. And even that stone that hits the feet in the image of the vision and smashes that statue, Nebuchadnezzar probably chalked that up as, well, that doesn't matter to me. That's long after I'm gone, So why not I almost got a guarantee from God that my kingdom is reigning supreme as far as now goes, and that's all that matters is when I'm here. Pretty selfish, isn't it? So let's look at the observations from the storyline. I know it's familiar to you guys. I often find that familiar stories, well, I have two attitudes toward it. It used to be predominantly attitude number one is, oh, I know that story. I don't have to take time to dig in that. I've known it since I was a kid. And this is one of those. And although I have recognized sometimes we hear stories so often, there's what I call, and this is my term, this is not a technical term, but I think there's probably a good academic word for this. I call it the saturation effect. You've heard it so much that it's like, it's, how would I put it? It's not like it loses its appeal, but I've come to a satisfaction stage about that story that I don't have to read it again. That's option one for me. Does anybody have a better term for that, or do you know what I'm talking about? I mean, how many times did you read, let's say, for example, what would be a common popular children's book that maybe you grew up reading? How many times do you need to read Cat in the Hat and you're still in awe? Is there any other story you would relate to? Are y'all there? I see people, I don't see people, I don't hear people. I see people. What's the movie? I see dead people. No, I'm kidding. Can you think of any story like that, Scott? Or do you know the effect I'm talking about? Does that sound familiar? I mean, I just feel like that's, okay, I'm so, and so we assume that we know everything about that story. But I know you guys are students of the Bible. I mean, you're here on a Wednesday night. That says something. in comparison to maybe mainline, the rest of the general Christian community. You are into learning more and more about the Bible. And so you know this next option or this next thing that I would also call a phenomenon or an effect is that no matter how many times you've read a story or you think you know a story, you usually will come across something you've never seen before. How many of you know that effect? And I don't know what to call that, except that I think that's what makes the Bible stand out in comparison to Cat in the Hats and anything else that you might have thought of, but you didn't, okay? I think that that's because it's the living Word. Now, it's not as though God grew some words in there since the last time I read it. Nobody inserted anything. Maybe because of modern day translating and newer versions that speak more of my language rather than the King James. And I love and have a great admiration for King James. I still quote King James because I grew up on it, cut my teeth on it. But I do appreciate the newer versions that help kind of make things a little more clear in my mind, if that makes any sense, the way we talk today. That might have helped in this. But I think it's more like, maybe as I read it, like 12 times ago, I needed something particular out of that passage that God made stand out. But maybe 12 times later, because of where I'm at in life compared to where I was 12 times ago, maybe there's something else I need from this story. And I feel that that's true in tonight's chapter. When I read this tonight, I picked up on what I would call subtleties. And now because of that, now because of the option 2 route that I usually go, rather than, oh, it's a saturation effect, I've seen this before, done it before, been there, done it. Now I always take this with this frame with this challenge to myself. I'm going to make sure I pick up on every little subtlety I possibly can, look at every word, definite article, indefinite article, all the conjunctions, everything, so that next time I'm not so surprised. But then next time I read it, guess what? Why didn't I see that before? Have you ever kind of thought that you had gremlins living in your Bible that sometimes go in there and add, oh, let's mess him up this time. We'll put something new that he's never seen before. Or something that was covered now gets revealed. It's just weird how that happens. I don't know of any other book that's like that for me. This chapter has been like this last 2 or 3 days as I've been reading and pouring through the chapter. Okay, let's look at the observations of the chapter. Nebuchadnezzar has made an image of what? Pure gold. How tall is this image? Did you read your footnotes? We don't talk in cubits, but it's about 90 feet. To put that into perspective, it's taller than most of our houses. I'm trying to think of something that is generally speaking around that. You know, I kind of thought at one time maybe the water towers were about that. Actually, the average water, I looked this up, the average water tower is about 130 feet in Oklahoma in its height. Wind turbines are like way up there. They're around the 630-foot mark, well over 100 meters. Can you think of anything else you could think of that might be of that height? Yes? 110 feet. So that's getting close then. We're kind of in that zone of how tall this image, and it's 9 feet wide. 9 feet wide. Now, you may think, well, compared to the things you just mentioned, it's not all that tall. Well, they didn't have wind turbines in the Bible. They didn't have water towers. Well, not that I'm aware of that look like ours anyway. They don't have the comparisons of all the comparisons. 90 feet tall would have stuck out. Plus the fact, where's this at? Where's it built? The plains of Dura, isn't it? The plains of Dura. It's in flatland. I know you know what flatland is. Anything that side of the interstate. In the north part of Oklahoma, it's pretty well flat. I mean, there's a few things. I know you get to Black Mesa and stuff, but you drive the Panhandle, I always recommend people drive it at night. It's more interesting. There's nothing to see in the day. But yeah, that's quite an image. Have you considered the weight? If it's solid. I looked it up. There's people that obviously have too much time on their hands and they think about things like this. And what I came up with is this thing probably weighed 8 to 9 million pounds, 4 to 5,000 tons. And then the guy who figured this up said, all the known gold in the year 2013 is only like 300 and something million pounds of it. This would have been about 3% of the world's collection of gold that we have currently. I don't know, probably wasn't solid. I can't imagine how they would have done that. A lot of things that were made of gold are things that are made out of wood overlaid with gold. That was some of the furnishings of the temple. So when it says pure gold, the gold that's used is pure. It may not have meant solid gold, or it may not have meant all of its construction is gold only. But what gold is used is 100%. I don't know. Just something to think about. Not that important maybe, but it's enormous and it's pretty spectacular, and it looks like, whether it was solid gold or not, it's going to look pretty cool. John?
Okay, I've built some towers on churches.
Mm-hmm.
65 foot tall.
Mm-hmm.
Freestanding.
Yes?
The footing on that was 20 foot square and 4 foot deep. Okay, that was what held the tower up.
Yeah.
This is another 30 foot tall.
Yes.
The scaffolding to get up there would scare most people to death just getting up there.
And now Babylon is known for its engineering feats. You know, the ziggurats predate the pyramids, and there's quite a bit of, I kind of wonder if they had any piers or pilings, you know, underneath this structure. What would it have taken? Yeah, yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. I know there's been many projects I've worked on, just I'm a do-it-yourselfer. I build something on the ground, think, okay, this is good, and I raise it up and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, why did I build it that big? And that happened to me recently on a little project, not anywhere near these dimensions, but yeah, that's pretty amazing. Yeah.
That doesn't seem that far until you start tipping it down.
Yeah.
Somehow it plays a trick on your mind.
Even a basketball goal, the rim is 10, right? I've climbed up a pole to retrieve a ball that was stuck between the board and the rim because, you know, I can't jump. But it looks like it's a different height when you're up there than when you're standing on the ground, even though it's not changed at all. That is an interesting effect. So it's a big image. And he summons all his officials, and he breaks that down, right? Satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and other provincial officials to come to a dedication day. And there's this announcement made. Let's read verses 4 through 6. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, that this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. One thing this says about Nebuchadnezzar is he wants this to be a big day for him, doesn't he? And he doesn't want any embarrassments. This is put out there. If you get the invite to the party and you show up and somebody announces, by the way, I went through all this trouble to make this cake. If you don't eat it, we're going to kill you. What are you going to do? Well, I always eat the cake, so it's not a problem for me. But what if it's something you don't care for, or maybe that you are totally opposed to? You know, this is a big, big consequence that he puts out there. It's not. It's kind of a. It's hospitable at first. It's very warm and inviting, but you'll do this or else. And it's like, oh, okay, what did we just show up to? As soon as the instrument sounded, everyone bowed down and worshiped. They don't just bow down, they worship the image of gold. Except for Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. This begs a question, and it should be obvious. At this point in reading the passage, what's your number one question? What happened to who? Mm-hmm. Okay. That is a good question. And I guess that's your first question that pops up in mind. That's not my first question. Anybody else have a question that pops up in mind of curiosity? Where's Daniel? He's mentioned nowhere in this chapter. Does this imply that Daniel bowed down? I can't picture that, can y'all? Yeah, but it didn't sound like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had gone either. They went looking for him, or I get the impression they did. Maybe I shouldn't say that. But they didn't bow down. And it seems like Nebuchadnezzar from the previous chapter was really eager to go make the search for all the wise men of my kingdom, and they're all going to be killed because nobody can tell me what the dream was. That this would have also been his attitude, or would have been the attitude here. Why wasn't a search made for Daniel? And I also think this. The astrologers had it out for these Hebrew children, Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. But they would have had the same attitude about Daniel, and they would have brought him up too. It's kind of a thing to ponder, isn't it? I think there might be some plausible options here, but it's all conjecture. You know, is he ill? Is he traveling? Is he sent on a delegation somewhere else on behalf of the king? There's some options there. I don't believe that he would have bowed down, do you? We already know about what he thought about, who was it, Darius that issued the decree about who prays, and he's still going to pray 3 times a day. That doesn't stop him. And of course, they are on to him about that. That's what eventually leads him into the lion's den. So it's just an interesting question. Some astrologers told Nebuchadnezzar about the defiance of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they say to Nebuchadnezzar, this is verse 12, we'll read it. But there are some Jews whom you've set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. We'll discuss this a little bit in the discussion questions, but I just want to go ahead and bring it up now as a preview. They have carefully chosen the way they're portraying Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego in front of Nebuchadnezzar. And there's a little bit of blame on you, Nebuchadnezzar. You're the one that set them up. That's kind of like we're reminding you, because remember, they are Babylonian. And these people weren't. All right? Nebuchadnezzar was furious and summons the 3 to question them and gives them a second opportunity to bow down. And they reply with this, verse 16. King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Does it sound like they believe what they believe in? Does that make sense? I know that sounds redundant. They truly believe what they believe in. I think part of the problem with Christianity today is we're not totally 100% believing what we say we believe in. I'm talking about in general terms, not you and I specifically. He ordered that the furnace be heated 7 times more its usual heat. Oh, by the way, I missed a bullet point. He's furious, and it says his attitude toward them changed. So it's heated 7 times more, so much more that the soldiers in charge of putting them in the furnace are killed. It's that hot. And it says Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell into the furnace. The way I picture that then in my mind's eye, it just makes sense that it had to be this way. When you're dragging them, they've got them on the verge of going in, but they die, and they're bound, aren't they? And they probably don't have the balance on their own, causing them to fall in. Which also makes me think this furnace is somewhere in a lower area, like in a pit, a fire pit of sorts. Nebuchadnezzar was surprised by the results. Let's read verses 24 through 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound, unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." And then Nebuchadnezzar approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." This is weird because it's so quick. It says his attitude changed toward them. It sounds like it changed quickly here. Wow. It makes me think only God can cause a person to do it like that. I don't see this as normal human behavior. I would think they would go into a state of denial, questioning themselves, kind of awestruck and kind of paralyzed in their thinking and other things that I have observed in human behavior. But you've got a God here at work that hardened and softened the heart of Pharaoh on the spot. And don't you think God's in charge of Nebuchadnezzar's heart? I think so too. And then we have the description of the condition that these 3 were in when they come out of the furnace. Verse 27. It says, "They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them." Scott, I know you do a lot of outdoor cooking. I love that too. You and I both probably have experienced this. You open up the grill. You're trying to turn that burger somewhere you couldn't find your long spatula, and you've got the short one from the kitchen, and what happens? Oh, yeah, it's all curled up here in your hair. Great smelling stuff, isn't it? Gail, you were a volunteer firefighter. I was remembering when we were out west of Hennessy, and it was round bells, but there was this field, and there was a farmer out there. He's trying to put a fire line out there, a fire break with his rake, I guess, or whatever it was he had. And I remember watching him go by us, and you could see the heat coming off the back of his neck and his clothing. And by the time he got off and we got him hydrated, he had hair sins all up and down, and he had a pretty hairy back. His hat looked like it had started melting. We've had fire trucks so close that the lenses off the headlights and taillights were melting. So you get close, you're going to feel the effect whether you have direct contact with the fire or not. Plus, a lot of times, a fire might get out pretty quickly by the firefighters and the hose and the water and all that, but you usually still have smoke damage. And sometimes what kills a person is smoke damage. None of that. No smell of fire on them. No smell. Pretty amazing. Nebuchadnezzar made the following declaration, verses 28 and 29. Praise be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command. You know what he's saying? Defied my command. They defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation of language or who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Now, I failed to read you something a moment ago. You read it, I'm sure. But when he goes back to them, questioning them and gives them that second chance, look at the ending of verse 18. Verse 15. When he says, if you don't do this, you'll be thrown immediately. And then it says, then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? He has a change of heart, doesn't he? And then he promotes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. And they were already rulers over it. So I don't know what that promotion meant. Another bar or patch on your sleeve, I guess. There it is. That familiar story. There's a lot to unpack here. This is probably the longest set of discussion questions I've ever come up with, so we better get started on it. You ready? Just for discussion. What do you believe Nebuchadnezzar was hoping to accomplish by building such an image? Yep. He's already been kind of given by the prophet of God himself this guarantee that your kingdom is a splendorous kingdom. Might as well bask in the sun. Make the most of it, right? By the way, in the next chapter, we see how he gets abased because pride goes before a fall. Anybody else have any answers on question 1? Yeah, it seems to be an inspiration to him. And that's a lot of gold. And he wants everybody around, every tribe, every language, every nation. He's making a statement. Which kind of leads me to this next question. Describe what you would have seen if you'd lived back in that day, what you would have seen and how you might have reacted whenever this image would come in view as you were traveling to the plains of Dura towards Babylon. Well, and I'm not talking about you wearing your halo thinking, well, I'm thinking of my Christian aspect, but just think of you got one of the invites. You're coming to the day of dedication. You have your gods. But boy, when you see that in view, wow, I can see it from this far out. I don't know, maybe that's not as impressive as some of us who are familiar with flat land in Oklahoma or Kansas. I remember one time, I forget who it was, said they could see the lights of liberal Kansas about 4 hours out. Which is probably true. I know this. As a young person, our youth group would often go to Six Flags. And one of the first things I'd ever look for is that big red derrick, the one in Texas. And as far as I know, it's still there. I haven't been in Six Flags in a long time. But I think that observation tower used to have slides. Anybody ever go to Six Flags? Barbara? Oh. Used to have slides that went like that, down to about halfway point. It was pretty cool. I guess it was too dangerous. They took it out. But I look for that tower, or I look for that Texas shootout. That was the tall tower, the parachuting coming down, or maybe one of the roller coasters, especially when the Shockwave, the double loop coaster was there. Those were the things I'd look for. Oh, I see it. And everybody in the van would get excited. We see it. Going to Oklahoma City didn't used to be this way until the Devon Tower was built. Now you can see the Devon Tower peak before you ever saw any hints of Oklahoma City there. And at first that's pretty impressive. I used to think that Oklahoma City had pretty tall buildings till the Devon Tower was built. And I'm thinking, man, all these others are dwarfed. Go ahead, John. Yes. Yeah. And there are several places where there are crosses erected by the roadways that stick out. Even in Hennessy, Oklahoma. Hennessy has a cross kind of going west. Now, yeah, you can see it because it sits kind of up on the hill. When you're coming from the west, you're seeing it. If you come from the east, the thing that's remarkable to see is their gymnasium. They built a huge dome. I don't know if you've ever been to Hennessy. You can see it from a few miles out. It's a pretty impressive structure. But that cross is pretty cool. You talking about the one in Oklahoma City by Edmond? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I've been to Christ of the Ozarks. Now, you can't see it from miles away because it's hills, right? It's hills in Eureka Springs area. But I've often thought about, is it Rio de Janeiro where I always thought that would be impressive. That would be pretty cool to see. Not man-made, but I always felt like the most majestic mountains I think I ever laid eyes on were the Grand Tetons coming into Wyoming in the Jackson Hole area. I always felt like, man, that's awesome. That's so awesome. Maybe you could, the Gateway Arch is 630 feet tall, so it's a lot taller, but when you're going to St. Louis, and even when we're flying, sometimes we get the announcement, if you look over here to your right, you'll see the Gateway Arch, and you can see it down there. And what's really cool about that is, if you ever go up in the Gateway Arch, and you look down, people look like ants. You don't like that? And if you mark a spot at the edge of the window, you know what's going on? You're moving. And yet at 30,000, it looks so small. Well, it's all about perspective. In other words, this thing is impressive. When you're coming into town, 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide, does it show up? It's gold. Pretty impressive. Let's go to 3. Describe the scene when everybody is surrounding the image and the instruments begin to sound. How would you describe that scene? Pandemonium? Huh? Deafening? I mean, if I'm not a Jew or if I'm not a Christian, I'm looking at that thinking, wow, this is pretty impressive. And I think that's what Nebuchadnezzar's trying to do, is impress you. Question 4, why were some of the astrologers eager to tell Nebuchadnezzar about the ones not bowing? Yeah. And you know this is true. Barbara in school administration, those of us who have dealt with kids, church or school, and not just kids, but I'll start with kids. There seems to be some kids bent on being the tattletale. Is that still going on in college even? I don't know. It's like there's a reward for being the whistleblower. Huh? Yeah, I know it happened. I started in the kids world because I know it happens in the adult world too. We either think there is an award for being the first to tell on somebody, or just even if it's not somebody in trouble, just telling news. Oh, if I can just be that first one to get that word out before they hear it from anyone else. It's like, what do you think you're getting, a ribbon for that or something? I was the first one that told it. Go ahead. Yeah. And a lot of times, and we find this true, especially in the adult world. I'm not so sure about the adolescent child age group, maybe. But a lot of times, what people will call out others for, they're dealing with that issue themselves. You'll find that to be. We've already asked question 5. Let's ask question 6. How do the astrologers portray these Jews in front of Nebuchadnezzar? we already alluded to it, but I said we would discuss it too, so. This was verse 12. These guys who you set over the affairs of the province, in other words, they're people with a responsibility, pay no attention to you. Now, that's kind of loaded. I do think they had a fair amount of respect for the people they were working for. But in particular to this scene, that would be a true statement probably, that they neither serve your gods, which was true, nor worship the image of gold you have set up, which was true. But they want to paint that to incite the result out of Nebuchadnezzar. They're loading him for a reaction, and they get it. Go ahead, Sam.
Well, what they're basically saying is, you elevated these people, you rewarded them.
Mm-hmm.
They don't respect them.
Yeah. I don't know that this plays into Nebuchadnezzar's thinking. But we've already seen where Nebuchadnezzar gave credence to Daniel's God and the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the interpretation thing. You think there might have been a moment, maybe just for a short time, because all we see out of the text is that he's furious. But could there have been that moment? It's like with Darius. When he's told about Daniel, it's like, oh, I didn't know my decree that you forced me to sign off on, that couldn't be repealed, by the way, was going to affect my friend Daniel. I wonder if there was a small sliver of a moment that Nebuchadnezzar didn't really take in all that might mean for his Jewish cabinet here. I don't know. It doesn't seem like it takes very long for him to be furious, which is question 7. Because really, how would it make him feel? We already know the furious part, but it's embarrassing. I've invited all my neighbor countries to be here. I've given this decree. I put out the warning. I've got some of my own people that won't obey me. That's embarrassing for him. Why do you think he gave them a second chance to comply? Question 8. He probably really didn't want all these guests that have gathered to actually see a burning in the furnace.
He didn't realize that he was going to be faced with that situation because he was saying gentle with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody wrong. Jesus was not. Now that
And what logical thinking?
boxed in because,
Yeah,
what am I going to do if I don't believe?
right. Because now I'll be seen as weak, a pushover. I don't want people saying I'm, what is it they call namby-pamby, whatever it was they used to say, that I'm a wimp, in other words. I don't want them to see I'm a pushover. He put it out there. He's got to stick to his word. And he probably originally thought, what logical thinking person would ever defy this anyway if they knew at the furnace? I mean, the bets and the odds on Vegas would have been nobody's going to do that. I mean, or not do it. Question 9. What view does Nebuchadnezzar have of himself in light of the following statement from the ending of verse 15? Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? And it doesn't seem, even though you have this great proclamation he gives at the ending of this chapter, but given what he does in the next chapter, it doesn't seem that this corrects him like it should. Question 10, I had this broken down because I like to study these segments of what he's saying. The following statements that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego made to Nebuchadnezzar. A, they say this: we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. And they could have just stopped right there and stayed true to the faith and be thrown in the furnace. What do y'all think about that part of that statement? That we don't feel like we need to defend ourselves before you. They don't feel compelled that it's necessary, right? Or maybe the emphasis is, we're not concerned about defending ourselves in front of you. It's God that we want, maybe it's the focus of who we're defending ourselves in front of. Right. That sounds similar to the statement Peter makes when they're told to quit preaching Jesus. We ought to obey God rather than men. And he's compelled to say, we can't help but speak the things we've seen and heard. You judge for yourself if it's right that we do this or not, but we've already made up our mind. This is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I love that conviction there. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, I think that they might feel that it's possible we won't be thrown. Maybe there's hope that Nebuchadnezzar, come on, are you serious about this? Anybody else want to say anything to that segment? If you single out the part C, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. Do you think they actually believed that? Yeah. And rightly so. And I get the impression that they were thinking that he would. And the next part, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. If you're going to defy the king, is it really going to matter in the end whether you use the respectful title, your majesty, or not? I find that to be interesting. But there's still a level of respect. We know who you are and what we are in position to you, but you don't upstage God, But we're still going to attribute to you your position of authority because they saw God put him there. I find that interesting. And then this is the most, and I've preached on this and taught on this a lot, so I know this is reaching that saturation point kind of with you guys maybe, but I just love this. But even if he does not, they're not going to conclude that if he doesn't, well, God, you abandoned us, where'd you go? We thought you were going to help. No, their resolve is, but even if he doesn't, that really does not matter to us. They might be in the back of their mind hoping he does. But if he doesn't, it still don't matter. We will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Anybody else want to speak to this resolve they have? Any one of these statements or all of them together? Mm-hmm. 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 When you compare your faith and any resolve that you think you can muster up, how does it compare to their resolve? I can only think of one word. Ouch. I'm just being honest. I'm speaking for me, not y'all, but ouch. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And according to Hebrews, that is what he was thinking. Question 11 is kind of alluding to why I think there might have been a sliver of hope that Nebuchadnezzar, or a sliver of regret that Nebuchadnezzar had made such a decree, because I do think he starts off with a level of respect for his own cabinet members. It says here his attitude toward them changed. It already said before that he'd become furious. But then it says after this attitude, he became angrier, more furious. Let's go to question 13. Nebuchadnezzar's anger quickly changed to excitement. How is it possible that someone can change their attitude like that so quickly? I can't come up with anything else that would be a plausible option than God had his hand in it, hardening and softening the heart of Nebuchadnezzar, just like we already knew he did with Pharaoh. Because I don't see that as normal human reaction or response. I can't think of any example, can y'all, of somebody who flip-flopped that quickly over such a determined, bent-on attitude. I can't see it.
I can go from excited to angry really quick. But from angry to excited.
Well, and then to switch back, and it's quick this way, but then it goes back quickly. That's the part that really... Because, okay, you might say, well, if I'd seen a miracle like he saw, that was obviously a miracle. But wait. Normal human reaction even to miracles in the New Testament has proven, even in the face of somebody being healed, didn't change the Pharisees' thinking. Go ahead, Don.
All I can think of is come close would be Saul and attitude from David. Because there were times when he just whacked his work and then he threw the javelin.
Yeah.
Then David would
Oh. I just thought of Will Smith. What was it, a year ago? I mean, that's kind of one of those examples. I mean, because he's laughing at, is it Chris Rock? He's laughing with him. Next thing you know, it's like, what you talking about? You know, and does what he does. But this is a I've gone this way, but I've gone back this way. Wow, it's amazing to me. Maybe not that impressive with others, but to me, this is really a really cool thing going on here that I think it just has to be a God thing. Well, after you read next chapter, you're going to think of a couple other diagnoses too. Number 14. Consider and discuss the statements made by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they say these things to Nebuchadnezzar. This is Nebuchadnezzar to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command. Were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Who say anything against the God, anyone who says that, of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way. And I find that in light of what he said to them earlier about, and then what God will save you. Well, he'd never seen it before, but now he has. Now, although... And in Nebuchadnezzar's defense, what happens in the next chapter, he does turn back around after he's been debased. He does come back to his cognitive reasoning and back to his senses. but this will lead me to the concluding points here. I guess I have time for. I had several concluding points. By the way, I highly recommend a book. This is a book written by Rick Atchley. He is the preacher at the largest Church of Christ, by the way, Richland Hills. This was written way 93. Sinai Summit. Has anybody ever seen this book? The Sinai Summit. This was a part of a faith-focused book series put out by Sweet Publishing. His contribution was toward the book of Exodus when Moses is on top of Mount Sinai talking to God. The majority of this book deals with the basic premise for the Ten Commandments. And so, you shall have no other gods before me, and not make an image to yourself of a god. And he defines idolatry as basically being anything that gets in the way of you and worship of your God. And it doesn't have to be a statue. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite quotes from him is, long before you have any metal images of your God, you have mental images of your God. It starts there. And idols come in different shapes, styles, and forms, and sizes, and it can be as little as a smartphone to as big as a statue. It could be a hobby, it could be your work, it could be a person that you're obsessed about. It could be a habit you have, a vice. Okay, bullet point 4. You can usually spot someone's idol by observing what they're the most devoted to in time, money, and talk. What do they talk about the most? That's going to point you to that idol in their life. We have a God who can protect us, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego proclaimed they had. And we need an even-if kind of faith. Would y'all agree with that? An even-if kind of faith. Instead of making deals with God, God, if you can get me out of this mess, I'll do this for you. God does not honor that. God does not honor that. What do we owe God? Everything. What does He owe us? Absolutely nothing. We cannot go to God like we're at a bargaining table. People have done it all the time, but it doesn't work. God is always with us, even in the fire. Who thinks that was Jesus in there with them? Or who thinks it's an angel that's in there? It's obviously somebody God sent, right? I used to think Jesus, and I'm not ruling it out because the older versions would say the Son of God or Son of Man, and when you look at the wording, it kind of lessened it a little bit and kind of opens it for, could be angel, could be God's servant, and that could have been any number of people maybe, or people God used. Any opportunity for standing up for what you believe without compromise is an evangelistic opportunity. You would not have had Nebuchadnezzar saying what he did about their God if they had not defied him and allowed themselves to be cast into that fiery furnace and then to come out, because that's what convinced him. Have you ever thought about if you compromise or give in on your faith statement, or if you miss an opportunity, that you might be missing out on being evangelistic with somebody? Your willingness to stand up and say something could be the exact thing a person just needed to hear for them to change their life. I guess when it comes to risk assessments and stranger danger, we have this statement that says if you see something, say something. I think that's a good saying for Christians. See something, say something. You believe something, say something. Not to alert somebody, but to declare to somebody. All right, I'm out of time, way past time. We wrap up our sermon series this Sunday, When God Rocks the Boat. In our storm season series, we're going to look at Jonah.